Thank you for joining us for the sixth annual Lit Fest, and welcome to all the new attendees who are able to join us because of this year's virtual format. My name is Jane Wald. I'm Executive Director of the Emily Dickinson Museum, which is owned by Amherst College, and I am hosting today's program. The festival is sponsored by the Center for Humanistic Inquiry at Amherst College, the Common Literary Magazine, the Emily Dickinson Museum, and the Croxton Lecture Fund. Of particular note this year is Amherst Bicentennial, which offers all members of the community ways to learn and engage and celebrate this unique milestone. Learn all about this by clicking the Bicentennial button in the upper right-hand corner of the college homepage. For book lovers, especially those interested in Amherst College history, there are three beautifully written bicentennial books. There's also the Solidarity Book Project, a community-based expression of art and activism through books, which is a participatory project, so you can join in. Again, find more information at the Bicentennial button on the homepage. And now I want to welcome you to this afternoon's program about Emily Dickinson's Amherst College, a tour developed by guides at the Emily Dickinson Museum in celebration of the college's bicentennial. The Emily Dickinson Museum is located at the edge of the college campus and includes the poet's homestead and the Evergreens, her brother's home right next door, as well as 3 acres of the Dickinson family's original holdings on Main Street. As you no doubt know, American poet Emily Dickinson was born in Amherst at the family homestead in 1830. There, she wrote nearly 1,800 poems that have taken their place among the very best and well-loved poems in American and world literature. Her family championed education, and through 3 generations, beginning with her grandfather Samuel Fowler Dickinson, were intimately involved in the founding and development of Amherst College through its first century. Emily herself, while never a student in the all-male institution, almost certainly attended lectures at the college and saw her very first publication, a kind of Valentine's Day prose poetry confection, appear in Amherst student literary magazine, The Indicator. In the next hour, you'll hear much more about the linkages between the Dickinson family and Amherst College in a tour developed by 4 museum guides and education programs manager, Elizabeth Bradley. We want to thank the Benesky Museum of Natural History and the Amherst College Archives and Special Collections for their resources and assistance in researching the topics you'll soon hear more about. Our first tour will be with museum guide Stephanie Bennett, who will talk about the Dickinson family, Amherst Academy, and Amherst College. Stephanie is an MA candidate in the Simmons School of Library and Information Science. She works with the Special Collections and Archives at the University of Massachusetts Libraries as an archival metadata specialist. Her interests in Emily Dickinson focus on the material environment, including architecture, archaeology, and facets of daily New England life. Next, we'll join Brenna McAray in meeting Emily Dickinson and her Amherst College friends. Brenna is an Amherst College senior, class of 2021, majoring in English. She's also a poet and illustrator. Brenna is preparing a creative thesis in poetry, a lyric essay exploring the world's interconnectedness through ecology, personal narrative, and Emily Dickinson's poetry and letters, themes that are central to Brenna's interests in Dickinson. Third, Christopher Faubert will discuss the Dickinson family, race, and labor in and after the Civil War. Christopher completed his PhD at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, specializing in the political economy of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He is an adjunct instructor in history at Worcester State University and Springfield College. Finally, Anna Plummer will give us a tour of Emily Dickinson and her global connections at and through Amherst College. Anna is a class of 2020 graduate of the college. She holds a BA in English and theater and dance. She's researched and written an article on Susan Davis Phelps, a friend of Emily Dickinson's in their youth. The article can be found on the Porter Phelps Huntington Museum's website. For today's program, there won't be a live Q&A following these presentations, but if you do have a question during the program, please go ahead and enter it in the chat. Elizabeth Bradley and I will do our best to respond while the tour is underway. And with that, let me introduce Stephanie Bennett, who will lead us through the Dickinson family, Amherst Academy, and Amherst College.
In this section, I'll be going as far back as the poet's grandparents up until the poet's departure from formal education at age 17. Amherst has a reputation as an idyllic old New England town. The Dickinsons of history knew a different Amherst. They were busy with the excitement, chaos, and instability of founding the college for which the town would later be so famous. Though Emily did not formally attend Amherst College, as Elizabeth mentioned, it was central to her world and her family's world. The famous poet was born in Amherst, Massachusetts, as you see here on the bird's eye map, on December 10th, 1830, to parents Edward and Emily Norcross Dickinson. We have a side-by-side portraits of them here. Her first home was the Dickinson homestead, located on the circled portion of the map there, the homestead. And here in a recent photograph, which is also the Emily Dickinson Museum. The homestead was built by her grandfather, Samuel Fowler Dickinson, in 1813. Emily was the middle child of 3, as you can see here. Her elder brother, Austin, at the center, was born a year and a half earlier, and her younger sister, Lavinia, in the sort of gray-blue dress, was born 3 years later. Already a scholar, Emily holds a book displaying a color image of her beloved flowers. There is a similar color plate flower book in the family collection, now housed at Harvard Houghton Library, inscribed to Emily from her father. The Emily you see in this portrait is about 10 years old in 1840. The same year she began attending Amherst Academy. We have a picture of it here. It's the larger 3-story house, or 3-story building. The Academy was the private primary and secondary school counterpart to Amherst College, preparing younger scholars for the rigors of a college education. Emily's grandfather, Samuel Fowler Dickinson, was a central figure in the foundation of first Amherst Academy and later Amherst College. In 1812, the original subscription for Amherst Academy was started by Samuel Fowler Dickinson and Hezekiah Wright Strong, Esquires, the same men to whom, beyond any other citizens of Amherst, the college afterwards owed its origin. According to the school's charter, the Academy mission was to prepare young people for the purpose of promoting morality, piety, and religion, and for the instruction of youth in the learned languages such as arts and sciences. Amherst Academy was the mother of Amherst College in this way. You can see they're very close to each other as well. In less than a decade, the same trustees of Amherst Academy became trustees of the college, laying the first cornerstone of the South College in 1820. Like the Academy, the mission was for the education of indigent young men of piety and talents for the Christian ministry. Many students did go on to serve as ministers and missionaries, as we'll hear about in a later presentation. Here we have a couple of views of the college, this one from the 1820s and this one from the 1840s. You can see just how many buildings you can build in about 20 years. And something that hasn't changed too much, which is just how lovely the college and the Emily Dickinson Museum is in the fall. These pictures are from both those locations. For the Dickinson family, Amherst Academy and Amherst College functioned as a source of spiritual and intellectual livelihood, employing and educating its members for generations to come. Unfortunately, in the years immediately after the college's founding, Samuel Fowler Dickinson was stretched to the breaking point. By the time the poet was a toddler, he was bankrupt. Fowler had sacrificed his property, his time, and his professional opportunities for the college. Although his son, Edward, the poet's father, tried to mitigate the situation by purchasing half of the family's homestead, eventually Samuel Fowler Dickinson was forced to leave Amherst with his wife and 2 youngest daughters and move to Cincinnati. Edward Dickinson, on the other hand, kept his wife and 3 children in Amherst, educating his children at the institutions founded by his father. He worked for the college's treasurer. He volunteered on the boards of both and remained fully integrated in their operations. The Dickinson family was constantly reminded of the sacrifices they had made for the success of these institutions. Likewise, the town was consistently face to face with the family that had made those sacrifices. Their legacy of sacrifice grew into a looming family mythology by the time a young Emily Dickinson embarked on her academic career in one of the institutions her grandfather helped found. Back at Amherst Academy here, Emily attended the academy from the ages of 10 to 16 during a turbulent time for both, really all parties. The Great Fire of 1838, just 2 years before she started attending, destroyed the irreplaceable records of Amherst Academy and the founding of Amherst College. Remember, because the same people had founded both institutions, a lot of that paperwork had been kept together. Following the fire, the rural academy struggled to find and retain teachers of merit. Heavy staff turnover caused standards to waver, and many of Emily's friends left for other institutions. For 2 years, Amherst Academy failed to publish course catalogs, a lasting reminder of the chaos the Academy felt during those years. Luckily, some record of this time period exists in Emily's letters to her friends. She had to write them because they were studying away from her, having left the struggling school. Despite daunting challenges, Emily began to forge intellectual relationships with some of the most stimulating minds of her time. Her love for her teachers and for learning permeates her writing, crystallizing their importance in her body of work. Despite Amherst Academy's pitfalls, Emily chided her friend Abaya Root in a letter for her harshness towards a teacher, saying, "I have some patience for these school marms. They have so many trials." This was a striking moment of understanding for Emily, who used her sharp wit to criticize as much as she did to praise. As we can see on the 1843 course catalog here, Emily Dickinson was able to attend courses at the college. And we know that she was enrolled in the classical curriculum, excuse me. And then here is a close-up for you of Emily Dickinson's name there. She threw herself into her studies as early as 12. Emily boasted to her friend Jane Humphrey that besides Latin, I study history and botany. I like school very much indeed. 2 years later, the confident, competitive Emily wrote her friend Abaya Root, "We'll finish an education sometime, won't we? You may then be Plato and I will be Socrates, provided you won't be wiser than I." So these young women were so well versed in classical studies, they could joke about it. Emily used her Latin playfully in her poetry as well, like in this early poem here. I've also included the English translation on the right. "Sic transit gloria mundi, how doth the busy bee, dum vivimus vivimus, I stay mine enemy." Emily also utilized the resources of the bright young men at Amherst College next door for even more language lessons. Her French tutor, Charles Temple, was a student at the college, and he created the silhouette of the 14-year-old Emily that you can see here. Emily's intellectual success was made even more impressive by her troubled health. Throughout her school years, Emily suffered respiratory illnesses that caused her to miss school for weeks or even up to a year at a time. Throughout these periods of convalescence, Emily kept up her studies to match the pace of her peers and spoke well of her teachers throughout this time. She also continued her herbarium expertly, often discussing it in her letters as it grew over time to over 66 pages of hand-pressed plant specimens. You can see a sample page here. A saving grace of the Academy during this turbulent time was their partnership with Amherst College. Amherst students were permitted to visit lectures in the natural sciences at the college as part of their course of study. You can see the section of the course catalog that outlines this ability on this slide. This meant that Emily had access to the author of her geology textbook, Edward Hitchcock, just down the road at the college. This is him here with some of the textbooks. Hitchcock is an integral figure in the history of Amherst College. The college also experienced upheaval during the 1830s and 40s while Hitchcock was a professor. Dissatisfied students and alumni regularly protested college decisions. One of the largest was the Gorham Rebellion, in which the entire class of 1838 was nearly expelled. Unrest helped inspire the formation of the Alumni Association formally in 1842, which is, of course, still active today. The association allowed alumni to effectively uphold tradition while also wielding lobbying power with the administration. In 1845, this power was used to oust President Herman Humphrey, the president during the Gorham Rebellion, and elect beloved natural history professor, Professor Edward Hitchcock, as his replacement. Hitchcock was an important influence on Emily Dickinson's intellectual and artistic development. When Emily Dickinson was just a toddler, Hitchcock conducted a geological survey of Massachusetts to assess the state's mineral resources, the better to promote their extraction and utilization and increase the understanding of geological history of the state. Emily read his textbooks and other publications in school. We have some image plates here, and likely attended his lectures as an Amherst College student, getting to see whatever Hitchcock pulled from his pockets, like these fossils from South Hadley, they're fish, courtesy of the Mennessi Museum. Whatever Hitchcock didn't show in class, Emily still had access to in the Amherst College research collections. For a 19th century young lady, Emily was exceptionally well-versed in geology, fossils, minerals, and gems from around the world, as well as her own corner of the world. One excellent example is in her poetry, which features numerous examples to beryl stone, a mineral found in central and western Massachusetts, much like this one on the top left, collected from a mine in Royalston, Massachusetts. Specimens like this would have been available to her in those college collections. Gemstone quality beryls had adorned the wealthy worldwide for centuries, such as the Georgian style pendant on the bottom left in that same green color. Beryl comes in a variety of colors. Its name is rooted in the Latin beryllus, which refers to a unique blue color that you can see on the right, which is like seawater. One of her many poems referencing the stone is this one here, which I can read for you. A pine bough, a feather from the whippoorwill that everlasting sings, whose galleries are sunrise, whose stanzas are the springs, whose emerald nest the ages spin with mellow murmuring thread, whose beryl egg what schoolboys hunt in recess overhead. And you can see these lovely robin's eggs can be seen to be a kind of beryl blue, if you will. Anecdotally, I do know of older folks in the region who talk about hunting for gemstones like beryls and garnets in gravelly areas. The task could even be used to challenge children to be quiet and focus and look at the ground. Anything to get your kids to be quiet and focus sometimes. Why not look for gems? Seems like a good hobby to me. Emily's formal education was finished in 1848, and she continued to spend time out and about with Austin and his friends at Amherst College. Though the path was sometimes rocky, her strong foundations at Amherst Academy and Amherst College, as well as 1 year at Mount Holyoke Seminary, allowed her to socialize on the same intellectual level as Amherst College students. So I'm going to stop screen share now so we can turn the presentation over to Brenna, and she can tell us more about Emily and her Amherst College friends.
So this section of the tour is going to be talking about Emily Dickinson's connections with Amherst College students. Austin Dickinson attended Amherst College, and his senior year at Amherst, 1849 to 1850, was a vibrant time for his sister Emily, in large part because of the fellow college students who were their mutual friends. The class of 1850, which is here on the right, contained a number of interesting characters, several of whom Dickinson got to know. Austin's extracurricular activities expanded Dickinson's own network, as his friends were frequent callers at the homestead. He was in the Alpha Delta Phi fraternity and was involved with and contributed to the student-run magazine, The Indicator. As her correspondences reveal, the vibrant and fun relationships Emily had with Amherst College students were great resources to her in many ways, expanding her horizons both in the literature she consumed and the creative endeavors she took on. 1849 and 1850 was a spirited social time for Emily Dickinson, who wrote to her uncle that winter, "Amherst is alive with fun this winter." She, along with several other young people, including 2 college student friends, ascended Mount Holyoke in October 1849, which must have been a lovely view of the valley decked in bright autumn colors, and they registered at the Summit House guest book, which is still a popular outing for 5 college students today. Emily had lively friendships with several students. One of these was William Cowper Dickinson, class of 1848, who's here on the left. And he sent her a valentine in 1849, which was apparently not quite up to Emily's standards, because she replied to it, "A little condescending and sarcastic, your valentine to me, I thought, a little like an eagle stooping to salute a wren." Her valentine to him the following year shows her creativity and mirth, and perhaps a hint of her riddling nature, including a snippet of a popular song illustrated with magazine clippings and little drawings, which was unique for a valentine, but then we would expect nothing less. George Gould, whose picture is on the left in this slide, was 8 feet tall, and he was a brilliant student, and he was another particular friend of Emily's. In February of 1850, he invited her to a candy pulling, and Emily notably saved this invitation, and 26 years later, she wrote a poem on the back of it about the passage of time, which reads, "I suppose the time will come, aid it in the coming, when the bird will crowd the tree and the bee be booming. I suppose the time will come, hinder it a little, when the corn in silk will dress and in chintz the apple. I believe the day will be when the jay will giggle at his new white house, the earth. That too, halt a little." That same February of 1850, Emily found her work published for the first time. A beyond whimsical valentine appearing in the Amherst College student magazine, The Indicator. Imperiously, she demands, "Sir, I desire an interview. Meet me at sunrise or sunset or the new moon, the place is immaterial. In gold or in purple or sackcloth, I look not upon the raiment. With sword or with pen or with plough, the weapons are less than the wielder. In coach or in wagon or walking, the equipage far from the man. With soul or spirit or body, they are all alike to me. With host or alone, in sunshine or storm, in heaven or earth, somehow or nohow, I propose, sir, to see you." And it goes on like that. Most scholars agree that the note was likely addressed to Gould in the first place. He was an editor of the paper, so it makes sense for it to end up there. And the editor's note to the valentine in the paper was written by this fellow, Henry Shipley, who asserted that it displays clearly an inductive faith, a kind of analytic spirit, identifying each independent truth and fixing it as a primary essence, which the author had known and felt. The author, however, has not, it is plain to see, told the half of her feelings. It were impossible. Shipley ends this with an imperious QED, which is the last and most edifying of all. Apparently, if you know where to look, the author of the mysterious and strange valentine was quite obvious. As this composition shows, Dickinson was certainly beginning to stretch her creative wings and developing a brilliantly unique poetic voice. Dickinson was also gaining several new literary points of reference that would enrich her correspondences and poetry. An added benefit of having so many college friends was being in the loop about the latest reading, and she took full advantage of this. But unlike today, the literature we now consider to be classic college curriculum material was not part of the coursework at all. There was no such thing as an English major, as we would know it, and such reading was decidedly extracurricular. But like today, students were eager to study the literature at the forefront of the intellectual vanguard of their day. The books that they introduced to Dickinson were the latest hot topics, and Emily was engaging with them critically as well. In 1851, Emily, Austen, and their sister Lavinia were all part of a reading club, along with other young ladies in town, several Amherst College tutors, and other college students. This was a lively and well-educated group, and it provides some neat insight into Emily's developing intellectual and literary opinions, as well as those of the town of Amherst's young people in general. Dickinson's friend Emily Fowler Ford reminisces later that when reading Shakespeare, one of the tutors proposed marking out the, quote, questionable passages in the members' texts for the sake of the young ladies present. And this received a staunch negative from said girls. Quote, finally, we told the men to do as they liked. We shall read everything. I remember the lofty air with which Emily took her departure, saying, there's nothing wicked in Shakespeare, and if there is, I don't want to know it. In the end, the whole text was read out boldly. Dickinson's love and study of Shakespeare was lifelong, so it can be safely assumed that she certainly did know which passages were wicked in the eyes of the male tutors. Her staunch opposition to its censorship, and the triumph over it in the end, point to a rebellious streak and a strong burgeoning intellectual backbone. We can see that streak and the impulse to read everything, despite propriety, even earlier. In 1849, Austen brought home Longfellow's Kavanaugh from college for Emily, and he hid it underneath the piano cover for her to read. There, it was perhaps safe from the censuring view their more conservative father Edward might take to such frivolous or extracurricular reading being snuck into the house. Emily seems to have gained much from the novel, filling the margins with faint pencil marks, noting passages that struck her. Notably, the book contains a romantic friendship between characters Alice and Cecilia, as well as a discussion about the merit of American literature in the Western canon. In 1850, Dickinson also got Emerson's poems from Benjamin Newton. Emerson's influence on Dickinson seems ever apparent but somewhat hard to precisely pin down. The transcendentalist emphasis on self-reliance, the infinitude of the private man, as well as the rejection of the traditional view of God as something separate from the natural world, find clear echoes in Dickinson's poetry. Furthermore, Dickinson's perception of the role of the poet in society can be linked to Emerson's ideas of the poet as representative of humanity, one who sees the real essence of things, or, as Emily herself might put it, this was a poet. It is that distills amazing sense from ordinary meanings. Later on, Elbridge Bowden lent Dickinson the novel Jane Eyre in the winter, and this had a huge impact on the poet and quickly became a favorite of hers. By the infamous February of 1850, she named her new dog Carlo, after the dog in the novel, and she mentions him in The Valentine, which is another clue to her identity in it. Jane Eyre was making a splash in society as well, engendering much criticism by some for its alleged impropriety, but finding more positive reception amid the young people of Amherst. William Gardner Hammond again reviewed it in the June 1848 issue of The Indicator, praising the heroine as having a feature, quote, more like self-reliance than anything else, a sort of self-concentration, a disposition to find sources of enjoyment only within one's heart, to cherish one's own peculiarities, and to look within oneself rather than to the world without for motives and rules of action. And I don't know about you, but reading this seems a little familiar. And in such a review, it may be clearly seen why Emily Dickinson enjoyed the book so much. The relationships that Emily Dickinson forged with Amherst College students as a young woman had a great impact on her development, both as a reader and as a writer. They introduced her to publication and to multitudes of new literature, and first fostered her burgeoning creative voice with their correspondences. But they didn't exist in a bubble. The town of Amherst, its college students, and the Dickinson household were all subject to rapidly changing sociopolitical tides as the 19th century progressed. And with that, I can transition to our next speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you here this afternoon to talk a little bit about the Dickinson family and their relationship to the Civil War. In the tense months following Abraham Lincoln's election to the presidency, the everyday lives of students at Amherst College and the Dickinson household transformed radically when Southerners fired on Fort Sumter. Students gathered at the college chapel to hear Professor William S. Tyler deliver a rousing address about patriotism that convinced many of those in attendance, including President William Augustus Stern's son Fraser, to volunteer for the Union Army. Less than 2 years later, Fraser fell at the Battle of New Bern in North Carolina. Edward's long tenure as the college's treasurer had led the Dickinsons and the Sterns to become close over the years. According to Emily, the entire family was devastated that Fraser's, quote, big heart had been shot away by a mini ball. Austin, however, fell into a deep depression. Emily explained that her brother, quote, says his brain keeps saying over, Fraser is killed, Fraser is killed, just as father told it to him. Austin may have avoided the same fate 2 years later when he evaded the draft by paying for a substitute to serve in his place. Emily spent the war years churning out poems from her now iconic writing table. These were some of her most productive years. With Edward pulling in revenue from Amherst College and a handful of other ventures, the family's hired servant, Margaret O'Brien, freed Emily from the tasks and chores that so often claimed her time at different points in her life. Looking out over Main Street, Emily's mind often wandered to the war. It was almost impossible to avoid it, since young men from Amherst College and the community would have passed by the house to reach the local train station her father helped to bring to town a decade earlier. One of those poems, My Portion is Defeat, written in 1862, reflected the traumatic and often deeply personal ways that the war upended everyday life in small New England towns like Amherst. My portion is defeat today, a paler luck than victory, less paeans, fewer bells. The drums don't follow me. With tunes, defeat, a somewhat slower means more arduous than balls. 'Tis populous with bone and stain, and men too straight to stoop again, and piles of solid moan, and chips of blank and boyish eyes, and scraps of prayer and death's surprise, stamped visible in stone. They're somewhat prouder over there, the trumpets tell it to the air, how different victory, to him who has had it, and the one who, to have had it, would have been contender to die. I don't know about you, but I've always felt that this poem is a clear illustration of the impact that the Civil War had, particularly on Amherst, but small New England communities in general. Margaret O'Brien's steady presence at the homestead reflected the vital role that Irish and African American laborers played in the community. Amherst College professors and administrators, for example, employed Charles and Eliza Thompson, Henry Hawkins, and others from the local Black community. It's likely that Charles and Eliza met on campus. Before their marriage, Eliza worked as a servant for Professor Charles Baker Adams, and her future husband, Charles, traded off jobs as a substitute custodian and servant to President William Augustus Stearns. The Dickinson family's economic stability and close ties with the college provided an avenue for the Thompsons and other low-paid members of the staff to find additional sources of income. For instance, Eliza's noted talents as a cook relieved Emily of some responsibilities. The relationship between labor at Amherst College, the homestead, and the Evergreens traversed generations as Charles and Eliza's son-in-law, William Henry Hawkins, found employment at the neighboring Dickinson households after Austin replaced his father as the college's treasurer. When Margaret O'Brien left shortly after the Civil War came to an end, the poet, quote, winced at her loss because I was in the habit of her. Forced to return to long hours of cooking and cleaning, she jested that, quote, the house is being cleaned. I prefer pestilence. In less than 2 decades, Amherst's relative economic stability and the devastated human toll of the war years softened much of the local nativist opposition that greeted Irish immigrants who arrived in Massachusetts fleeing the potato famine. Although Emily proudly proclaimed in her younger years that she would happily have Austin, quote unquote, kill some of the Irish who flooded into the state because, quote, there is no room for the Americans, her tone changed markedly in the post-war years. In 1869, Margaret Marr replaced Margaret O'Brien after a 3-year hiatus without a permanent live-in servant. The lasting impact the two women and their families had on the poet was unmistakable. During the window between Margaret Marr's and Margaret O'Brien's steady presence at the homestead, Emily's reclusive tendencies led her to withdraw from the broader public. Marr became an unwavering ally in this process by sheltering the poet from unannounced guests who called at the homestead. Serving as a type of gatekeeper, Maggie, as she was affectionately known, often turned away uninvited visitors with a poem and flowers that emerged from the second-floor bedroom to soften the blow of rejection. Despite Marr's steady hand in administering household duties, deteriorating eyesight, Edward's sudden death in the mid-1870s, and her mother's long-term convalescence after a stroke prevented the poet from returning to her previous productivity. Outside the picturesque gardens and orchards that defined Emily's daily existence at the homestead, the sleepy New England town of Amherst was not immune to the economic instability and decadence of the Gilded Age. In the midst of the worst economic crisis of the 19th century, Austin took over his father's position as the college's treasurer in 1873. Finding the books in a state of disarray, he spent years working with a Boston accountant to create an accurate picture of the institution's finances. Although Austin eventually helped to return the college to profitability, in the short term, it was hemorrhaging money. The stress of Austin's multi-year effort to restore the college's economic stability did not relieve the Dickinsons of their social responsibilities as one of the town's leading families. After Edward's death, the family's center of power shifted from the homestead to the Evergreens. Prominent authors and other consequential visitors who spoke at Amherst College frequently found their way to Austin and Susan Dickinson's Italianate villa next door to the homestead. Once there, they experienced a radically different environment from the elegant simplicity of the homestead. Hudson River School paintings, call bells, and carefully carved wooden ornamentation were among the decorative features that made an architecturally unique house for the time and location stand out even further. Although the Evergreens was unmistakably elegant in the town of Amherst, locally prominent New England families like the Dickinsons slowly faded as industrialists consolidated their control over the nation's economy. Over the course of the respective lifetimes of Edward and Austin Dickinson, their push to link Amherst with more prominent economic centers in the state, like Springfield, Worcester, and Boston, to secure the college's and the family's economic stability, promoted global connections that facilitated a growing diversity economically, racially, and socially that slowly moved the community away from its conservative roots. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Anna, who will talk to us about Emily Dickinson and her global connections.
In this final section, I'm going to discuss the global connections that Emily Dickinson had through Amherst College. As new townspeople and foreign goods took the train in, Amherst College was sending its own out all over the world. Global awareness grew in Emily's community throughout her adulthood as information on foreign places and people circulated like never before. When open, the front doors of the Evergreens offer a view down Seeley Street, formerly School Street, which is a straight shot to Amherst College campus. Austin and Susan Dickinson welcomed privileged members of the larger Amherst College community across that threshold to exchange news and stories. Such news came from near and far, thanks to the school's driven scholars and a longstanding commitment to Christian mission work. Despite the Dickinson family's disgruntled attitude toward aspects of change and racial diversification in their town, the college acted as a force for cultural education and progress even under their own roofs. So, German philosophy, Italian art, Greek architecture, and accounts of life in the mission field across Asia and Africa converged in conversations here. Amherst College's global connections shaped Emily's ideas about faraway countries and cultures, enriched her poetic palette, and expanded her sense of calling to the vocation of poet. By 1863, Amherst College graduates had dispersed to nearly 20 different countries for mission work. Alumni who traveled as far as Turkey, South Africa, China, and Brazil remained in touch with their professors, friends, and family in the Amherst area. Justin Perkins, who was class of 1829, established Christian missions in Persia, today's Iran, in the 1830s, where he reported back to friends including the Sweetsers, Edward Hitchcock, and Emily Dickinson's own quirky aunt, Elizabeth Currier Dickinson. Extending from the college's remarkable number of graduate ministers and clergymen, the town served as home base to an influential network of foreign missionaries, and you're seeing some of their letters here. Likewise, Amherst College's growing reputation abroad brought in students from Asia Minor, the Sandwich Islands, and Greece, all before 1860. The school's first Japanese student and founder of Doshisha University, Joseph Hardy Nisima, graduated in 1870 when Emily was 40. These individuals and reports of their experiences increased Emily's awareness and gave her a more accurate picture of the Middle East and Asia during the height of Victorian Orientalism. Among Dickinson's circle, Austin's peer Daniel Bliss and his wife Abby Wood Bliss headed to Syria in 1855. Abby was one of Dickinson's closest girlhood friends. Discussing Daniel's ordination that same year, Emily dispatched the following to another confidant, Jane Humphrey. Mr. Bliss's coronation takes place tomorrow at the college church. Charge to the heathen by the pastor. Front seats reserved for foreign lands. Jenny, don't let your duty call you far hence. Distances here seem pretty long, but I confess when it gets to that one crosses the Mediterranean, 'tis even farther off, nor can car, nor can carriage carry me. There is even evidence that Abby wrote to Emily from Syria, for Emily's collection of plants includes Middle Eastern specimen probably sent by Abby, and you're seeing one of those here. The town esteemed their missionaries, generally sharing an urgent sense of Christian duty, which Emily mocked in a letter to Jane Humphrey. Supporting missionaries also signaled one's alignment with the college's core values, which prioritize preparing young men to, quote, enlighten the lands, unquote, by spreading Christianity. Edward Dickinson subscribed to the report of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, where he listed 8 Dickinsons as contributing members, including Emily in 1855. Emily may have had little say in this public usage of her name, but she would have read the letters and reports from abroad printed in the Commission's periodical. Like Abby Wood Bliss, many alumni of Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, where Emily attended from 1847 to 48, also became missionaries or married Amherst College men headed abroad. Emily had little interest in evangelizing, but her full-time pursuit of poetry required similar self-determination. Many missionary women modeled having their own careers at a time when most women did not. Ultimately, Emily would respond to the missionary conversation by finding her calling and escape in poetry, and devoting herself to her work with a similar, nearly religious fervor. Geographic descriptions, maps, and illustrations, and anecdotes of local culture and political strife made their way back across the ocean directly to Dickinson's community. Alongside her reading of popular literature that expressed more sensationalist views, Dickinson also absorbed the travel writing of American voyagers, scientists, and missionaries. In the family library, the Dickinsons kept reports including Elisha Kane's Arctic explorations and David Allen's India Ancient and Modern. However, nearly all of Emily's sources on foreign countries were written by Westerners, and missionary accounts often reflected prevalent colonialist ideas. This helps explain why Dickinson's writing at once echoes the cultural stereotypes of her time, while, as one scholar writes, demonstrating knowledge of contemporary politics in Asia and critiquing Western attitudes. Though Amherst College staff and students cultivated a reputation as travelers of the world, the Dickinson siblings clearly preferred vicarious travel. Austen's painting collection reveals a passion for foreign landscape. And from a vase and stand or tabaret fashioned in the popular Eastern style and door curtains hung on bamboo rods, to a small folding screen with a painted Japanese landscape, the decor in the evergreens represents a trend in material exotica, as well as the exceptional global awareness of this small New England town. It was no coincidence that a visitor returning from abroad, if invited into the library, would have stepped onto a Turkish rug toward a prominently displayed globe. Like Edwards making public his support of international missions, Sue and Austen found their place among the college's worldly scholars by putting their taste for foreign artistry on display. Missionaries were not the only Amherst College affiliates setting sail for faraway countries. Austen's friend Fraser Stearns traveled to India for health reasons in 1859, and college faculty took vacations in Europe. Professors of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, geology, and other subjects traveled abroad to further their studies, often returning with artifacts of culture and landscape. Emily experienced many of these international materials firsthand at the college. At the opening of the Woods Cabinet in the Octagon, she saw rocks and minerals collected in Europe, the East and West Indies, Jamaica, Syria, and South Africa. The Ichnological and Adams Zoological Cabinets in Appleton Hall, where Dickinson probably attended openings, housed locally and internationally sourced animal, insect, and plant specimens like these. The Dickinsons knew some of these traveling professors well, and Emily shared a long-lasting friendship with Professor Richard Henry Mather and his family. Mather taught Greek and German at the college for 31 years, and also had a passion for Greek archaeology, art, poetry, history, and philosophy. A true liberal arts thinker, he must have shared many interesting conversations with Dickinson. By 1875, Mather's Amherst legacy had taken the form of a large collection of art and artifacts acquired during his travels, including plaster casts of Egyptian, Mycenaean, Greek, and Roman sculpture. Several of these decorate Fairweather Hall today, home to Amherst's Department of Art and Art History. The Mather Art Gallery in Williston Hall was complete with replica Ghiberti doors and a bas-relief copy of the Panathenaic frieze from the Parthenon encircling the main hall. The space likely fueled Dickinson's classical interests, which had taken seed while at Amherst Academy and continued through her adulthood. If Emily visited the gallery, she could be immersed in a recreated world of classical art and architecture. She relished that sensation of travel abroad and back in time as she wrote the 1862 poem beginning, "A precious moldering pleasure 'tis." The verse imagines Sappho as a living girl and Beatrice in the gown that Dante deified. Dickinson almost enters this distant place, in her words, experiencing what interested scholars most, what competitions ran, when Plato was a certainty and Sophocles a man. Comparable to Austen and Susan's display of foreign vistas and exotic decor, this poem illustrates that Emily's vicarious travel took place in her writing. Peaking in the mid-1850s through early 1860s, Dickinson's poetry frequently invokes the East and other foreign lands as places of creative freedom and fulfillment. Notably, this occurred in conjunction with a spike in the number of missionary graduates, many of whom were situated in those areas. In the poem beginning, "She died at play, gambled away her lease of spotted hours," for instance, Dickinson borrows the stereotype of an overindulgent Turkish sultan to construct an image of opulence and luxury. Yet in 1860, she probably wrote about the sun sinking as gaily as a Turk upon a couch of flowers because she knew of Amherst folk actually in Turkey. Dickinson donned her own vestments of the East when wearing her multicolored paisley shawl, patterned with the popular teardrop motif that originated in Persia and India. And here it is on her bed. Oops. It draped her shoulders on chilly mornings in the garden or at her desk. Through the Civil War years, Dickinson used scenery ranging from St. Domingo to Sicily to the mountains of Kashmir, and more geographic metaphors in general. After 1860, her poems that refer to Asia become especially nuanced and political, such as Civilization Spurns the Leopard, which is just one among the 70 Asia-referencing poems that she composed between 1858 and 1881. Many of these poems described a freedom and fulfillment as remote to her as the Alps, yet also committed to achieving that freedom through the language itself. Emily exercises her power of travel again in a poem penned in 1863. And it begins, "I cross till I am weary a mountain in my mind. More mountains, then a sea, more seas, and then a desert find. And my horizon blocks with steady drifting grains of unconjectured quantity as Asiatic rains." Dickinson's poetry has now reached more corners of the earth than she knew existed. Frost Library at Amherst College holds editions of her poetry in 6 different languages, and she has also been translated into Russian, Spanish, Turkish, Swahili, Arabic, Portuguese, Korean, and Amharic, to name a few. Meanwhile, Amherst's own student and faculty populations have grown increasingly diverse. Whether students apply themselves to law, music, geology, or even Dickinson's poetry, their combined perspectives help make the college a fulcrum for global understanding. The story of the college, from its very inception, extended beyond its halls to the local and global community. Immigrants and Black, Indigenous, and people of color have always been a part of the college and integral to its success. Similarly, women did not formally become Amherst students and faculty members until the mid-20th century, but the involvement of women like Dickinson strengthened the learning community. Much has transformed since Dickinson's time, but after 200 years, Amherst College maintains its enterprising character and a strong sense of its history. It is largely thanks to the decades of alumni who share in the school's identity that the stories, faces, numbers, and many links to the Dickinson family discussed this afternoon were once recorded. Today, the self-dubbed Writing College, which strongly considered the Fighting Poets before choosing the Mammoth as its new mascot in 2017, makes one more thing clear. Emily Dickinson has shaped the identity of the college almost as much as it once shaped her.
Thank you for joining this tour of Emily Dickinson's Amherst College. Special thanks go to museum guides and researchers Stephanie Bennett, Brenna McRae, Chris Faubert, and Anna Plummer, along with Education Programs Manager Elizabeth Bradley, the Benesky Museum of Natural History, and the Amherst College Archives and Special Collections. LitFest continues this afternoon, first with readings of their own creative work by the Commons Literary Publishing interns, and then following that, alumni authors' readings of their work. And then don't miss these events tomorrow. At 11 a.m. will be a tribute to Joseph Brodsky with The Poet's Prose, rereading Joseph Brodsky's essays today. And then at 1 p.m., Cullen Murphy is in conversation with Pulitzer Prize winner Anne Applebaum. All LitFest authors' books are available for purchase at bookshop.org/shop/Amherst Books. Thanks for joining us today. We hope you'll enjoy the rest of LitFest 2021.